He wasn't just a king, he was a monster of desire. In Henry's chamber, love became war, pleasure became torture, and a kiss could end in execution. History remembers kings by their conquests, their monuments, their heirs. But Henry VIII is remembered for the wives he destroyed, the courtiers he silenced, and the blood he spilled not only in the public square, but behind the locked doors of his private chambers. The English throne during his reign was not gilded with peace, it was soaked in fear, and nowhere was that fear more intimate, more suffocating, than within the very space meant to represent safety, his bedchamber. To understand the horror of Henry's rule, one must first strip away the grandeur of the Tudor court, the feasts, the ceremonies, the painted portraits, and look instead at the grotesque contradictions within the man himself. His body was both the weapon and the battlefield. Once celebrated as a golden prince, Henry's health decayed with his power. His massive frame swelled, ulcerated, and reeked of infection. Yet it was this same failing body that he used as an instrument of domination. His bed, which should have symbolized intimacy and trust, became a throne of cruelty, where passion was corrupted by paranoia and marriage vows became death sentences. Each queen who entered that chamber understood, in ways too grim to ignore, that love was secondary to survival. Catherine of Aragon spent years enduring humiliations, watching as Henry sought annulment to cast her aside. The intimacy of their union was not just undone, but turned into a weapon. Her failure to bear a surviving son was twisted into treason against the crown itself. Anne Boleyn, who once conquered Henry with her wit and allure, soon discovered the true nature of the bed she shared. It was a trap. The same passion that lifted her to the highest seat in England dragged her to the scaffold at Tower Green. Her execution framed as the inevitable conclusion of a private betrayal recast into a public crime. Henry's bedroom became an antechamber of death. Whispers of infidelity, often manufactured or exaggerated, carried more weight than oaths of loyalty. In a court defined by suspicion, a queen's most private acts were catalogued, judged, and ultimately condemned. The language of intimacy, love, fidelity, fertility was transformed into the language of politics, alliances, legitimacy, succession. The bed was not a place of tenderness, it was a tribunal, and Henry sat as its sole judge, jury, and executioner. But the cruelty extended beyond the queens. Courtiers, servants, and confidants lived in constant awareness that what occurred in Henry's private sphere could dictate their fate. A jest at the wrong time, a glance interpreted as disrespect, a rumor whispered about the king's virility. These were enough to condemn a man to the block. The boundary between the personal and the political collapsed entirely. Henry's wounds, both physical and psychological, metastasized into a reign where paranoia was policy and death the most common form of decree. The horror of Henry's private chambers was not simply in the acts themselves, but in the spectacle they created. Every dismissal, every annulment, every execution was staged as a public reaffirmation of his absolute power. What had begun as private disappointment, a child not born, a desire unfulfilled, was transformed into national tragedy. The execution of Anne Boleyn, for example, was not only the silencing of a wife, but a political theater that reasserted the king's control over both body and nation. By turning his bedchamber grievances into affairs of state, Henry blurred the lines between the crown and the corpse. This grotesque pattern reached its apex with Catherine Howard, the young queen whose beauty became both her weapon and her doom. Brought into Henry's chamber as a symbol of renewal, she was soon condemned as unfaithful, her body scrutinized not with affection but with suspicion. When she begged for mercy before her execution, historians record her cries as the sound of a girl destroyed by the very intimacy that once secured her crown. In her story, the full terror of Henry's private rule is laid bare, a bedroom that promised closeness but delivered carnage. And so, the blood-stained throne was not a metaphor but a grim reality. The union of bed and power meant that no space was safe, no vow secure. Kingship was measured not only by decrees written on parchment, but by the bodies discarded in pursuit of an heir, of control, of vengeance. Henry VIII turned the private sphere into a theater of cruelty, where intimacy ended in execution and passion decayed into paranoia. What lingers from this chapter of Tudor history is not merely the tally of 6 wives or the reshaping of the English church, but the haunting recognition of how power corrupts even the most human of bonds. The very bed meant to cradle love became an altar of sacrifice, feeding Henry's desperate quest for legacy, and in that transformation, his reign left behind not just laws and dynasties, but a lesson carved into history's darkest corners. When power intrudes upon intimacy, the result is terror beyond comprehension. To understand the horrors that unfolded in Henry VIII's private chambers, one must first grasp the wider landscape of Tudor England, a kingdom perpetually balanced on the edge of uncertainty, where the survival of a dynasty rested upon fragile alliances and the desperate hope for a male heir. The throne was not yet secure, the monarchy not yet invincible. Every whisper of rebellion, every question of legitimacy, and every rumor of betrayal threatened to unravel a crown that had only recently been stitched together by blood and conquest. The Tudor dynasty itself was born out of violence. Henry VII had seized the crown through the carnage of Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses, but leaving behind scars that would not easily fade. His victory marked the birth of a new royal line, but it was a dynasty haunted by its own precarious origins. To the English nobility, the Tudors were not ancient rulers with centuries of legitimacy. They were survivors, opportunists who had clawed their way to power. That fragility echoed throughout Henry VIII's reign, embedding paranoia into the very foundation of governance. From this climate emerged an obsession that would define Henry's life and his legacy: succession. In an age where dynastic continuity meant stability, the absence of a male heir was not a private sorrow, it was a national crisis. The king's bedchamber, therefore, was not simply the site of passion or betrayal. It was the crucible in which the fate of the realm was forged. Each wife, each child, each pregnancy carried with it the weight of a nation's survival. When sons were not born, when infants died, the entire kingdom trembled. This obsession with heirs poisoned the atmosphere of the court. Queens were judged not as partners, but as instruments of dynasty, their worth calculated in bloodlines rather than affection. The personal was indistinguishable from the political. Catherine of Aragon's inability to produce a surviving male child was not merely her tragedy, it was cast as a failure against the crown itself. And when Anne Boleyn followed her, celebrated first as the key to renewal, her downfall too was entwined with this relentless demand for succession. It was not enough to inspire passion, she had to secure the dynasty's future. When she did not, she too was cast into the void. Yet the instability of Tudor England was not confined to matters of the royal bed. Beyond the palace walls, Europe watched closely. Rival powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, waited for weakness. The papacy too loomed as both ally and adversary, its authority clashing with Henry's will. Any fracture in the king's personal life threatened to ripple outward into rebellion, invasion, or civil war. Thus, the politics of marriage, annulment, and execution were never private matters but international declarations. Each discarded wife sent shockwaves through Europe, altering alliances, provoking enemies, and deepening England's isolation. Fear became the currency of the realm. At court, nobles maneuvered cautiously, knowing that a single misstep, a poorly chosen alliance, an imprudent word about the king's household could lead to ruin. The climate was suffocating, for intimacy with the king was both the greatest prize and the most dangerous snare. Men who had once been favored, advisors, confidants, even childhood companions, were suddenly branded traitors, their bodies left to rot on Tower Hill as warnings to others. Women who once shared his affections found themselves accused of treason, their private lives dissected under the brutal scrutiny of political necessity. The king's health only deepened this atmosphere of instability. As Henry aged, his body deteriorated, and with it his temper. The leg wound that refused to heal festered into a daily reminder of mortality. Pain gnawed at him, twisting his once vibrant persona into a storm of suspicion and rage. His need for control grew sharper as his physical power waned, and the kingdom itself mirrored his fragility. Powerful, yet unstable, commanding, yet perpetually on the brink of collapse. In such a kingdom, the bedroom and the throne became indistinguishable. Each queen's fate was tied not simply to her husband's desire, but to the fate of England itself. The intimacy of marriage carried the weight of dynastic survival, and failure was met not with private grief, but with public condemnation. What unfolded between Henry and his wives was more than a story of passion and betrayal. It was the stage upon which the monarchy itself was tested, reshaped and stained with blood. Tudor England lived perpetually on edge, the line between personal and political erased by a monarch whose fears governed his every act. The throne demanded heirs, demanded loyalty, demanded submission, and when those demands were not met, the consequences were catastrophic. This was not merely a reign of kingship, but a reign of fear, where every subject, from the highest noble to the queen herself, lived under the shadow of suspicion. The kingdom on edge was thus both literal and symbolic. England teetered between survival and collapse, between obedience and rebellion, between the legacy Henry so desperately sought and the ruin that always threatened at the margins. His bedroom was its fault line, the space where politics and intimacy fused into one deadly equation. It is here that the true terror of the Tudor age begins, not in the battlefield or the council chamber, but in the private heart of a monarchy built upon fragility, desire, and blood. When Henry VIII first ascended the throne in 1509, England saw not a tyrant, but a golden prince. He was 17 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and brimming with the vitality that his father, Henry VII, had so carefully denied the court during his own cautious reign. To a nation wary of the shadow of civil war, the new monarch embodied hope, youth, power, and splendor all wrapped into one radiant figure. But beneath the pageantry of justs and feasts, beneath the cultivated image of a king blessed by divine favor, already there stirred the darker appetites that would one day turn his reign into one of the most infamous in European history. Henry's early life was steeped in indulgence. Unlike his elder brother Arthur, who had been groomed for the throne with strict discipline, Henry was initially a second son, meant for the church rather than the crown. This unusual upbringing granted him freedoms rare for a royal heir. Time to study languages, theology, and music, but also freedom to cultivate the pleasures of the body. He rode, hunted, danced, and performed with a vigor that dazzled foreign ambassadors. In him, physicality and kingship were inseparable. To Henry, the body was not merely flesh. It was a divine instrument, proof that God had chosen him to rule. His strength on horseback, his mastery of arms, his endurance on the tilt-yard, these were not hobbies, but visible manifestations of divine kingship. This conception of the body as a royal instrument shaped Henry's appetites. Every feast became a display of abundance, every tournament an assertion of virility. He was said to devour not only food but also music, sport, and companionship with insatiable hunger. Court chroniclers noted his endless capacity for entertainment, his desire for excess. In these indulgences lay the seeds of cruelty, for he came to believe that what he consumed, whether flesh, wealth, or loyalty, was his by divine right, and that nothing should obstruct his satisfaction. Marriage only intensified these impulses. His union with Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was framed as both a political necessity and a personal victory. Henry delighted in presenting himself as the gallant young husband, vigorous and devoted. Yet from the beginning, even this sacred bond was measured not in affection, but in proof of potency. Children, especially sons, were the true test of his divine body. Each miscarriage, each lost infant, was not perceived as misfortune, but as a personal affront to his virility, a wound to his belief that God had blessed him uniquely. It is here that the first shadow of his cruelty emerged, for Henry's understanding of kingship and the body allowed no room for weakness, neither in himself nor in those closest to him. When Catherine failed to produce a living son, it was not the will of fate he saw, but betrayal by her body against his own. The same hands that caressed in youth could sign decrees of annulment and execution in maturity. His hunger, unchecked and sanctified by his theology, would transform private disappointment into public brutality. Even in his early reign, the spectacle of the king's body was inseparable from political power. Ambassadors reported in awe of his athletic prowess, his booming presence at court, his charm and laughter. Yet behind that radiant facade was a demand for constant affirmation. Henry craved not only admiration but submission. Those who surrounded him, courtiers, musicians, servants, were consumed by his presence, drawn into the orbit of a monarch who believed his body itself was England's destiny. The jests and feasts were more than entertainments. They were rituals of dominance, rehearsals for the cruelties that would follow. The court itself mirrored the king's appetites. His extravagance drained the treasury, but none dared to protest. Instead, nobles competed to feed his desires, offering him feasts, pageants, and alliances. To serve Henry was to satisfy him, whether through loyalty, companionship, or sacrifice. It was a climate of consumption, where the monarch devoured not only banquets, but the lives and fortunes of those who surrounded him. The kingdom became an extension of his appetite, every subject reduced to sustenance for the glory of his reign. Yet time and mortality were waiting. The very body he worshipped, the flesh he believed to be divine, would betray him. The athletic youth would rot into a diseased tyrant. His indulgence would become his prison. But in the golden years of his youth, Henry could not foresee the decay. He reveled in strength, in beauty, in conquest, believing his appetite was eternal. It was in this belief that his hunger was limitless, that his body was divine, that the foundations of his later cruelties were laid. For appetite unrestrained, when armed with divine justification and absolute power, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. Henry's youthful indulgences were not harmless pleasures, but rehearsals for the reign of terror to come. In his laughter was already the shadow of screams, in his feasts, the foreshadowing of executions, in his passion, the seeds of paranoia. The young monarch's appetite, once dazzling and celebrated, would become the blood-soaked engine of a kingdom's fear. The Tudor crown was not secure. It rested on the fragile promise of continuity, and continuity demanded heirs. For Henry VIII, this truth became an obsession that consumed his reign, poisoned his marriages, and transformed his queens into sacrifices upon the altar of succession. What should have been bonds of trust and intimacy were reduced to transactions of flesh and womb, each wife measured not by her companionship or wisdom, but by her capacity to bear a son. The legacy of civil war still haunted England. The Wars of the Roses had left dynasties shattered and bloodlines precarious. Henry VII had seized power through conquest, but conquest alone could not secure a dynasty. His son, Henry VIII, understood that without a male heir, the Tudor crown would once again be vulnerable to rebellion and foreign manipulation. This dread shaped every decision of his private life, twisting marriage into politics and intimacy into strategy. Catherine of Aragon was the first to feel the full weight of this burden. Married to Henry for more than 2 decades, she endured pregnancy after pregnancy, the majority ending in stillbirth or early death. Only one daughter, Mary, survived infancy. In another age, Catherine's loyalty and dignity might have been enough. But for Henry, the absence of a son was not a shared tragedy. It was a betrayal. Her body, once the foundation of alliance between England and Spain, became in his eyes a failed vessel. With each lost child, the marriage was stripped of its sanctity until it stood as a symbol of dynastic failure. Anne Boleyn was summoned as the remedy. She was not merely a woman who captured Henry's passion. She was imagined as the key to renewal, the answer to God's silence. But to take her as wife, Henry would defy the Pope himself, fracturing England's ties to Rome and setting the stage for schism. Anne's allure was transformed into political revolution, her womb treated as the crucible for the future of the dynasty. And yet, like Catherine before her, she could not deliver the son Henry demanded. Her fate was sealed not by her wit or ambition, but by her failure to bear the male heir who would secure the throne. She fell from queen to traitor, condemned by manufactured charges, executed not merely as a woman scorned, but as a failed instrument of succession. The cycle repeated with chilling precision. Jane Seymour was raised to the throne not for love, but for promise. She gave Henry his long-sought son, Edward, but paid with her life in childbirth. Jane's death was framed as sacrifice made holy, the price exacted for a dynasty's survival. In her passing, Henry discovered not the fragility of his demand, but a renewed justification for his cruelty. If one wife could succeed, the others had simply failed. Catherine Howard, the young and vibrant bride, was brought into the king's chamber as a symbol of rejuvenation. Yet her body, too, became ensnared in the relentless scrutiny of succession. Her alleged indiscretions, whether true or fabricated, were cast as crimes not only against her husband, but against the very stability of England. Her execution was staged as another necessary purging, a reminder that failure in the most intimate realm was indistinguishable from treason. Finally came Catherine Parr, who survived not because she satisfied Henry's obsession, but because his body had already begun to betray him. By the time she entered his life, the king's flesh was rotting, his health collapsing under the weight of disease and age. Catherine Parr became nurse as much as wife, managing his court and calming his temper, surviving not through fertility but through diplomacy. Yet, even she bore the weight of succession, tasked with preserving the fragile line through the education and protection of Henry's children. Each wife was consumed by the same unrelenting demand. Their bodies were battlegrounds where dynastic survival was waged, their fates determined by miscarriages, stillbirths, and the presence or absence of sons. Intimacy was weaponized, failure was punishable by exile, annulment, or death. Love, desire, even loyalty mattered little in the shadow of succession. Henry VIII's cycle of wives reveals more than personal cruelty. It exposes the terror of a monarchy bound to the body, for in Tudor England, the king's obsession with heirs was not merely private desperation. It was national policy, written not in law but in the blood of women. The succession of wives and their destruction was political theater, designed to remind subjects that the body of the queen was inseparable from the fate of the crown. In the end, the wives of Henry VIII became less remembered as individuals and more as symbols, sacrifices in the relentless pursuit of a dynasty. Their stories remind us that under the shadow of power, intimacy can be stripped of humanity, reduced to duty, and punished as treason. The crown demanded heirs, and the women who could not provide them paid the ultimate price. In Henry VIII's reign, the private sphere was never private. His bedroom, the innermost chamber of his power, became an arena of domination, its rituals observed, its silences recorded, its failures weaponized. Desire was not simply a matter of flesh. It was a political act, monitored and dissected by a court eager to secure or exploit the king's favor. What should have been moments of vulnerability became spectacles of scrutiny. Under Henry's gaze, intimacy was stripped of tenderness and remade into a theater of control. The paranoia that haunted Henry's public life seeped into his most personal spaces. The court was populated by spies, informants, and opportunists who knew that the king's sexual vitality was as much a matter of state as his military campaigns. Physicians recorded not only his illnesses but his potency, reporting on his ability to perform his conjugal duties. Midwives and attendants monitored the queen's pregnancies, documenting every sign of fertility or failure. Even whispers about the king's virility circulated as political currency, for his strength in bed was tied directly to the imagined strength of the crown. Failure to produce heirs transformed the bedchamber into a battlefield of humiliation. Catherine of Aragon's miscarriages were not private griefs. They were tallied as public evidence of divine displeasure. Anne Boleyn's stillbirth of a malformed child was whispered through corridors as proof that her union with Henry was cursed. Every reproductive failure was weaponized against the queen, but by extension, it also called into question the king's own body. And so, to preserve his image of divine potency, Henry shifted the burden of failure onto his wives, recasting their bodies as defective, treacherous, or tainted. Surveillance became both a shield for his pride and a blade against those who disappointed him. The presence of physicians within these intimate affairs reveals the grotesque entanglement of science, superstition, and politics. Reports on the king's ulcers, his obesity, and his declining fertility were concealed from the public but exploited within courtly intrigues. Rivals and allies alike speculated about his ability to sire children, using the private details of his decaying body as ammunition. Rumors that he was impotent, that God had withdrawn his blessing, spread in dangerous undercurrents. To counter them, Henry enforced a system of control that demanded constant affirmation of his masculinity. He staged public jests and tournaments long after his body had begun to fail him, desperate to display strength, while behind closed doors, surveillance of his queens ensured that blame for infertility was never his to bear. The king's bedroom was not simply the site of sexual union. It was a court within a court, where attendants carried secrets like daggers. Servants observed the rhythms of his private life, reporting even the smallest details to those who might use them to their advantage. To be close to Henry in his most intimate moments was both a privilege and a death sentence. Men who served him too faithfully risked being accused of knowing too much. Women who pleased him risked their lives if they failed to satisfy the greater demand for succession. In this environment, desire was inseparable from fear. Spies and informants extended this culture of surveillance outward into the broader court. Every flirtation, every rumor of infidelity was collected, catalogued, and used to shape the king's suspicions. Anne Boleyn's downfall was constructed not through undeniable evidence, but through fragments of gossip, twisted into accusations of adultery and treason. Catherine Howard, too, was destroyed by the relentless monitoring of her past and present, her private indiscretions turned into public crimes. The Queen's body was never her own. It belonged to the machinery of surveillance that encircled the throne. Humiliation was a constant weapon in Henry's arsenal. To reject Catherine of Aragon publicly was to reduce her from queen to an unwanted widow, her honor stripped before the eyes of Europe. To execute Anne Boleyn was to expose her supposed sins in the most violent spectacle imaginable, a reminder to all that the king's desires were absolute and that resistance to them meant obliteration. These acts were not mere punishments. They were performances of power, staged to remind courtiers and subjects alike that even the most intimate aspects of life were under the king's command. What emerges from this system of control is a portrait of a monarchy where desire itself was politicized. Henry's sexual life was not hidden in shadow, but dragged into the glare of politics, scrutinized, monitored, and manipulated. The bedroom became a site of policy, the queen's fertility a national concern, the king's virility a matter of propaganda. Spies, physicians, attendants, and courtiers formed an apparatus of surveillance that blurred the line between personal and political until no such boundary existed. In the end, the system consumed itself. By making his bedroom a theater of control, Henry created a culture of suspicion that devoured both his queens and his peace of mind. Intimacy became indistinguishable from betrayal, and love indistinguishable from treason. What should have been the private refuge of a monarch was transformed into a prison of constant observation, where every act carried the weight of politics and every failure was punished with ruin. The legacy of this surveillance remains as a chilling reminder. When power demands intrusion into the most human of experiences, love, desire, fertility, the result is not stability but paranoia. Henry's bedchamber, once the symbol of virility and strength, became the most dangerous court in England, where the price of intimacy was often death. The Tudor court was a theater, but for queens the stage was never safe. A smile, a whisper, a glance interpreted wrongly could ignite suspicion. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the walls of their private chambers became traps, sanctuaries transformed into execution chambers long before the blade touched their necks. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had captured Henry's imagination with wit and defiance, once seemed untouchable. She had risked everything to displace a queen, endured the hatred of a kingdom, and finally delivered what Henry desired most, a new beginning. But she had not given him a son, and in Tudor England, a queen's worth was measured not by charm or intelligence, but by the child she placed in the cradle. Whispers turned into accusations. Her flirtations, once tolerated, even admired, were reinterpreted as treasonous seductions. Courtiers and rivals, eager to survive, sharpened their tongues into weapons. When Henry's affection turned cold, her fate was sealed. She was paraded not as a queen but as an adulteress, condemned by fabricated confessions extracted under torture. The same bedroom that once elevated her above Catherine of Aragon now marked her as a sinner unworthy of life. On the scaffold, she faced the executioner with the composure of one who had learned too late that the king's love was a sentence, not a safeguard. Catherine Howard, barely a woman, became the second to fall. Young, spirited, and naïve, she was chosen less for strategy than for the promise of pleasure. But Henry, by then swollen with age and disease, demanded from her a loyalty she could not comprehend. Her past was scrutinized, her every step shadowed. When her indiscretions surfaced, secrets whispered among servants and lovers. The king's court once again roared with scandal. Unlike Anne, Catherine lacked cunning allies or political armor. She faced the storm naked, her youth weaponized against her as proof of wantonness. Dragged through halls that had once echoed with music and laughter, Catherine Howard screamed for mercy as she was condemned. Her death was swifter than her terror, yet her story lingered as a chilling reminder intimacy with Henry VIII was no gift. It was a gamble where the stakes were flesh, and the reward was survival. The fall of these queens was more than personal tragedy. It was a performance of state. Their deaths served a purpose to remind courtiers, nobles, and even the people that the king's bed was an extension of his throne, and betrayal, real or imagined, would be repaid with blood. The Henry who once dazzled Europe, a vigorous athlete, a monarch of golden promise, had vanished. In his place emerged a man imprisoned within his own flesh. By the 1540s, the king's body had become both battlefield and weapon-bloated, diseased, and rotten from the inside, yet still used to project authority, still wielded as a tool of domination. An old jousting wound in his leg festered for decades, swelling with infection, filling his chambers with the stench of pus and decay. He grew monstrously obese, so swollen that mechanical devices were required to hoist him into bed. His courtiers covered their faces. Physicians whispered in dread, but none dared speak of the truth. The body of the king was disintegrating. And yet, it was not only his flesh that deteriorated. Henry's mind warped with the decline. As his body betrayed him, his obsessions deepened. He became paranoid, convinced that whispers of his impotence were spreading through the court. Each failed attempt at intimacy echoed like treason. To admit weakness was to invite challenge. So he converted his shame into cruelty, punishing those around him as though their suffering could mask his own. Doctors were ordered to probe, bleed, and purge him, their instruments invading not only his body but the political theater of his bed. Remedies were brewed with desperate alchemy, potions to restore virility, ointments to heal festering ulcers. But nothing returned him to the man he once was. Still, he demanded that his queens and mistresses pretend. They were required to perform the role of consort, to affirm his potency, even as his body crumbled beneath the weight of disease. Intimacy became ritual humiliation. Women were drawn into his orbit not as partners, but as mirrors reflecting back a virility he no longer possessed. The court became a laboratory of control, where spies monitored his private struggles, and rumors of impotence were punished as if they were treason. His decay was no secret, yet it remained unspeakable. Instead, his agony was transmuted into terror, projected onto those who lived closest to him. The once magnificent king, musician, juster, lover, had turned into a creature of flesh and fury. His body, grotesque and corrupted, became both symbol and sentence, a reminder that power sustained through violence eventually consumes itself. Each step he took echoed with pain. Each night he spent was filled with restless rage. And through it all, his courtiers learned that to serve Henry VIII in his decline was to watch death advance one ulcer, one spasm, one humiliation at a time. If Henry's throne was built on blood, his bedchamber was steeped in humiliation. The world remembers the pyres, the scaffolds, and the axe at the Tower of London, but behind closed doors lay cruelties of another kind, quieter, more intimate, and therefore more insidious. These were torments not displayed before cheering crowds, but enacted in the silence of silk-hung rooms, where fear replaced desire and power turned the language of intimacy into a litany of degradation. By the later years of his reign, the king's chamber no longer resembled the sanctum of a monarch, but the stage of a prison. Physicians, confessors, and servants moved in and out like wardens, each witness to his decline, each participant in rituals of control that blurred the line between medical necessity and calculated torment. To be summoned to Henry's side was to risk humiliation. Courtiers whispered of women forced to submit to examinations designed less to heal than to expose, as though their very bodies existed only to remind the king of his slipping virility. For Henry, the body of the other, whether queen, mistress, or courtier, was never private. It was political property, to be surveilled and punished when it failed to serve. Historical records speak of his obsession with accusations of infidelity, which were investigated with a brutality indistinguishable from torture. Queens were interrogated about their lovers, their every gesture turned into evidence, their most intimate lives dissected in the language of treason. The court itself became an extension of the rack, where reputations and bodies were broken together. Anne Boleyn's fate had already revealed how swiftly love could be rebranded as conspiracy, how whispers of adultery could be magnified into a capital crime. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, endured the same ritual of destruction, dragged from bedchamber to council chamber, her sexuality weaponized against her until her beheading became inevitable. But the cruelty did not end with their deaths. It lingered in the way Henry demanded that future queens live as if under constant surveillance, knowing that their very survival depended on rehearsing devotion, concealing revulsion, and enduring the degradations of a man whose appetite for control outweighed his ability for affection. In private, the king's frustrations at his failing body translated into acts that hovered between the medical and the sadistic. Accounts speak of women compelled to report on their menstrual cycles, their fertility measured and catalogued as though they were livestock. Physicians were ordered to extract confessions from bodies, probing for signs of health or failure, their hands serving both science and monarchy. Such scrutiny reduced intimacy to examination and affection to testimony under oath. What separated Henry's private torments from his public spectacles was only the absence of an audience. In both arenas, pain was currency. In both, fear was the instrument of obedience. For the queens who lay beside him, the marriage bed was no refuge. It was the scaffold in miniature. The touch of the king was no caress, but a test. Failure meant ruin, resistance meant destruction. Even his courtiers were not immune. The gossip of men in his inner circle could condemn them as easily as the faint suspicion of female betrayal. Reports suggest that servants who displeased him were struck, berated, and sometimes banished for the smallest misstep. His chamber became an echo chamber of terror, where the simplest act, helping the king into bed, dressing his suppurating wounds, risked igniting fury. This was the paradox of Henry's final years. The more his body betrayed him, the more he demanded the suffering of others as proof of his authority. Public executions displayed his wrath to the world, but private humiliations reassured him that even in weakness, he still commanded absolute submission. The scaffold executed his enemies, the bedchamber executed dignity. Thus, the legend of Henry VIII is not only written in the blood of those who fell by the sword or the axe. It is also etched into the silence of closed doors, into the terror of women who understood that their wombs, their fidelity, and their very breath were instruments of royal performance. His cruelty reached its most horrifying when no one was watching, when the performance ceased to be political theater and became the raw assertion of a dying man's power over the most vulnerable arena of human life, the body itself. To understand Henry VIII is to recognize that in his reign, intimacy and death were inseparably bound. What began in whispers beside the bed often ended beneath the axe. The king's private obsessions did not remain confined to velvet chambers or whispered confidences. They were transmuted into public spectacles of blood. His inability, or refusal, to distinguish between desire and dominance forged a new kind of tyranny, one in which the executioner's block stood as the final punctuation to failed love. The pattern is unmistakable. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant object of his passion, was raised to the throne only to be destroyed by the same desire that crowned her. Her supposed infidelities, largely fabricated, amplified, or imagined, were condemned not as personal betrayals but as treason against the state. A queen's body, once worshipped in private, became dissected in public trials, her imagined sins detailed before courtiers who understood that her execution was not justice but ritualized humiliation. The king's passion, once intoxicating, was converted into an appetite for destruction. Catherine Howard suffered the same trajectory. A girl of 17, lifted by Henry's desire, was just as swiftly consumed by it. When rumors of her previous liaisons surfaced, they were not treated as youthful indiscretions but as mortal crimes. What should have remained in the realm of confession and forgiveness was transformed into an indictment. Her sexuality, whether exercised before or during her queenship, was recast as treason. The scaffold, not the confessional, awaited her. Desire had shifted seamlessly into death, as it so often did when Henry's private needs collided with his public authority. The executions of courtiers, too, bore the fingerprints of the king's bedroom. Men accused of sharing a queen's affection were not only condemned as adulterers but branded traitors. George Boleyn, brother to Anne, was forced to face a grotesque accusation of incest, an absurd charge, but one that suited Henry's paranoia and hunger for spectacle. In these trials, the line between sexual crime and political treason blurred entirely. The bedroom and the body became sites of evidence, their supposed betrayals inflated into justifications for beheadings. This was not simply cruelty, it was theater. Each execution was staged as a cautionary tale, a warning to subjects and rivals alike that intimacy with the king carried risks equal to rebellion. The scaffold became an extension of the bed, both arenas where Henry performed his sovereignty, both places where submission was demanded, and both stages where failure resulted in destruction. The axe, like the marriage bed, was a tool of discipline. Observers across Europe watched in horror and fascination. Ambassadors reported not only on policies and wars but on the fate of queens, whose deaths reshaped the diplomatic map as much as any treaty. To foreign courts, Henry's private life was indistinguishable from his public reign. His marriages dictated alliances, his divorces and executions rewrote international loyalties. The personal became political, and the political became drenched in blood. There is a grotesque symmetry in the way his reign unfolded. The very desires that had fueled his pursuit of heirs and mistresses were the same impulses that condemned so many to death. His body demanded control, and when control faltered, punishment followed. Women, men, courtiers, even entire factions of nobles were sacrificed to preserve the illusion of his dominance. Thus, desire itself became weaponized. To be loved by the king was no blessing. It was a summons to the scaffold. To arouse his passion was to awaken the machinery of surveillance, jealousy, and accusation, and to resist, or even to fail in fulfilling his expectations, was to invite annihilation. Henry VIII's reign, therefore, illustrates a truth darker than any single execution that unchecked desire, when fused with absolute power, destroys not only individuals but the very fabric of society. In Henry's England, the bed and the block were inseparable, each reflecting the same philosophy, that intimacy without dominance was impossible, and that love without obedience was treason. And so his legacy is not only the 6 wives, nor the rivers of blood spilled on Tower Hill, but the haunting lesson that desire, when corrupted by power, becomes indistinguishable from execution. In his kingdom, to love was to risk death, and to share his bed was to lie down beside the scaffold. By the final winter of his reign, Henry VIII no longer resembled the gilded prince who had once embodied England's promise. What remained was a carcass animated by rage, a monarch imprisoned within his own rotting flesh. His body, swollen to monstrous proportions, was so heavy that special contraptions were required to move him. The leg ulcers that had festered for decades now bled and oozed incessantly, filling his chambers with a stench so foul that courtiers approached him with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. His once virile frame had become a grotesque parody of sovereignty, yet even in ruin, he demanded that all kneel before him as if he were still God's anointed prince. Isolation consumed him. Wives had been discarded or executed. Friends betrayed, ministers broken. Those who survived did so by adopting the masks of sycophants, whispering reassurances to a dying man who demanded illusions of power. His court had become an echo chamber of terror where truth itself was treason. Physicians hovered helplessly, probing, bleeding, and purging a body beyond salvation, their treatments indistinguishable from torture. But Henry's agony was his own creation. The torment he had inflicted upon others seemed to have been etched into his flesh, as if his body were exacting a final revenge. At night he lay restless, tormented by both pain and memory. He who had humiliated wives, ordered executions, and reduced intimacy to surveillance, now found himself the most scrutinized of all. His breath monitored, his movements observed, his decline whispered about beyond the velvet curtains of his chamber. Fear, once the weapon he wielded, now wrapped itself around him. He trusted no one. Every hand that brought him food might conceal poison. Every doctor's draft might hasten his end. Even in his last days, paranoia devoured him more completely than disease. The king who had once wielded desire as an executioner's blade could no longer master his own body. Impotence mocked him, disease ravaged him, and the bloated weight of his frame left him immobile, trapped inside the very flesh he had celebrated as divine. The body that had once symbolized strength, virility, and command now mirrored corruption, excess, and decay. Henry had become the living embodiment of his reign, magnificent in ambition, monstrous in execution, and doomed by his own insatiable appetites. On January 28, 1547, death finally claimed him. The courtiers who had tiptoed in dread around his chamber dared not pronounce him dead too soon, for fear of treason, yet dared not delay, lest the kingdom fracture in uncertainty. His passing was not greeted with relief, but with the heavy silence of a court trained to hide emotion. England's most terrifying monarch lay motionless, his body bloated and broken, a tyrant undone by his own flesh. But even in death, Henry inspired dread. His corpse, swollen with gases of decomposition, reportedly burst in its coffin, as if his body itself could not be contained. Legend claims that dogs licked at the blood that seeped from his tomb, a final grotesque spectacle echoing the cruelty of his life. Whether apocryphal or not, the image endured, for it seemed fitting. A man who had consumed so many lives in pursuit of dominance now consumed himself in decay. The death of Henry VIII was no release. It was the culmination of a reign where love had been mutilated into domination, where desire had ended in death, and where intimacy had been transformed into surveillance and cruelty. His final hours mirrored his tyranny, isolated, paranoid, and suffocated by the very body he had once glorified. History records him as both builder and destroyer, the king who gave England its break from Rome, but also the tyrant who left a nation traumatized by fear. His true legacy lies not only in laws or institutions, but in the haunting lesson that unchecked power corrupts even the most private human bond. For Henry VIII, the throne and the bed were indistinguishable, and both became stages of torment. Thus ended the life of a king who could not separate passion from punishment, love from domination, or sovereignty from fear. In his death, as in his reign, Henry VIII remained what he had always been, a man whose body and whose desires consumed everything around him, including himself. The reign of Henry VIII did not end with his death. It lingered, heavy as the smoke of a pyre, in the ruins he left behind. 6 wives, 2 discarded, 2 executed, 1 who died in childbirth, 1 who outlived him. Each became symbols of the crown's insatiable appetite. Their fates were not simply personal tragedies. They were chapters in the rewriting of England itself. The story of Henry's bedroom became the story of England's religion, politics, and future. His private desires fractured the ancient unity of Christendom. A king's longing for annulment tore England away from Rome, reshaping faith not from doctrine or reform, but from the bruises of his bed. What followed was not liberation, but a church born in compromise and fear, an institution molded to serve the appetites of a single man. Cathedrals stood, hymns were sung, prayers were offered, yet all carried the shadow of their origin, a monarch's hunger to control the most intimate aspects of life. The monarchy itself bore the scars of his cruelty. Succession, once the obsession of his reign, remained unsettled even in death. He left 3 heirs, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, each destined to inherit not merely a crown, but the torment of their father's legacy. Edward's reign was fragile and short, Mary's was bloodied with persecution, and Elizabeth's was haunted by the example of 6 stepmothers who had been sacrificed to the altar of dynastic survival. Each child bore, in their own way, the imprint of a father who had fused intimacy with tyranny. England, too, was changed. Where once courtiers had aspired to serve, now they trembled. Where marriage had been a sacrament, now it was a weapon. Where kingship had been a sacred trust, now it was a theater of domination. The nation carried the bruises of its monarch's paranoia, scars etched not only into the bodies of those executed, but into the very conscience of a people who had learned to bow before cruelty in silence. Across Europe, his reputation spread like a contagion. Diplomats, priests, and princes spoke of him not as a statesman but as a warning, a man who shattered alliances for lust, who spilled noble blood for suspicion, who transformed his bed into a battlefield. His name became synonymous with excess, a cautionary tale whispered in the courts of Spain, France, and Rome. In the chronicles of Europe, Henry VIII was less remembered for laws or victories than for his appetites, his violence, and the blood that flowed from both. And yet, the greatest ruin was not institutional or political. It was human. Behind the grandeur of palaces and the splendor of processions lay the broken lives of queens, courtiers, servants, and subjects who had endured the suffocating weight of his power. The monarchy survived him, the church reshaped itself, the dynasty continued, but the private cruelties, those inflicted in whispers, in bedchambers, behind closed doors, echoed long after his death. They shaped the destiny of England in ways no policy or proclamation could. Henry's legacy is thus one of paradox. He is remembered as both architect and destroyer, the king who built a new church but shattered faith, who pursued heirs but left dynastic uncertainty, who sought greatness but became the embodiment of grotesque tyranny. His life teaches a darker truth, that the private cruelty of a ruler does not remain private. It leaks outward, staining laws, altering religion, and reshaping the lives of generations. In the ruins of his reign, one finds no triumph, only warning. The bloodied throne, the broken queens, the silenced courtiers, the fractured church, these are the monuments Henry left behind. His true monument is not Westminster or Windsor, but the lesson carved into history that when desire and domination are fused in absolute power, both the bedroom and the kingdom become stages of ruin. Centuries after his death, Henry VIII's name still looms like a specter across history, not merely as a monarch, but as a symbol of human excess, cruelty, and the peril of unchecked desire. His throne is remembered, yes, but more enduring are the whispers of his bed. The 6 wives have become cultural shorthand, their fates reduced to rhymes and school lessons. Yet beneath the simplification lies a truth that continues to haunt. These were lives destroyed by a man who could not separate passion from domination, nor power from intimacy. Modern audiences, scholars, and storytellers return to Henry's story not for his wars or treaties, but for the horror of his private reign. His marriages read like a Gothic tragedy, each wife a chapter in a book of cruelty. His chamber becomes a site of macabre fascination, where desire turned to humiliation, and where the most private acts bore consequences as catastrophic as any battlefield. In the centuries since, the world has not forgotten the scaffolded queens, the bloody trials, the grotesque body of the tyrant dissolving in its own decay. The fascination lies in paradox. Henry VIII is both distant and disturbingly familiar. His story warns of tyranny, yet it entertains with the same magnetic pull as a tragedy or a horror tale. He satisfies a primal human curiosity, how love becomes violence, how desire breeds terror, and how private cruelty can alter the destiny of nations. We recoil from his brutality, yet we cannot look away, for his reign forces us to confront a truth that transcends centuries. That power, when fused with obsession, corrupts not only kingdoms but the human soul itself. In the modern age, Henry is endlessly resurrected, in novels, films, television series, and historical debates, not because his policies resonate, but because his appetites horrify. He is remembered less as the builder of the English Navy or the founder of the Anglican Church, and more as the man who destroyed wives, courtiers, and friends in the theater of his paranoia. His cruelty is no longer political memory alone. It has become cultural myth, a cautionary spectacle retold for audiences who recognize in his story the dark reflection of their own age. What endures is not admiration, but fear of how intimacy becomes weapon, how authority becomes terror, and how a king could transform the most sacred bonds into instruments of ruin. The horror of Henry VIII is not confined to his own century. It is the horror of human weakness amplified by absolute power, the horror of desire warped into death. Thus, his legacy survives not as triumph, but as warning. To study Henry is to study the grotesque potential of monarchy, the theater of cruelty that unfolds when no boundary restrains appetite. He fascinates because he horrifies, and he horrifies because he shows us the extremes of what a man, unbounded by law or morality, can become. In the end, Henry VIII endures not only as a king of England, but as a figure of eternal dread, a reminder that power, left unchecked, consumes love, consumes life, and leaves behind only ruins and memory. His reign may have ended, but his story continues, a haunting tale whispered across generations, the tyrant who made his bedroom into a scaffold and his desire into death.